in the book, you kind of explore it through this kind of portraits of different, very important scientists. You know, you've met, I think, all the big names, it seems, in kind of in these areas. And for me as a neuroscientist, it's great that it starts off with Christoph Koch, who's a really important neuroscientist who worked with Francis Crick in the early 90s. So maybe that's a good place to go, because you were really on the scene, you know, when you had this kind of the real kind of flowering of a scientific approach to consciousness in these kind of conferences in the 90s.
Yeah, so I've known Christoph, and I've never known how to pronounce his last name. Different people pronounce it different ways. You pronounce it Koch, which I often go with because that's what it looks like, K-O-C-H. But it's also, I've heard Koch or Koch, or anyway, I'll call him Christoph. I've known him since the late 1980s as kind of the sidekick of the great Francis Crick, and they were saying that they could explain consciousness. And as I said before, they had this very materialistic program for figuring out consciousness and tracing it to brain states. As I got to know Christoph, I realized that he was a complicated person. He was a devout Catholic, a practicing Catholic through much of the 90s, which is ironic because Francis Crick is one of the great hardcore materialist atheists of all time, but they still had this wonderful friendship. And I wasn't sure about the connection between Christoph's Catholicism and his materialism. And then in when was it, like 2005 or 2007, Christoph suddenly announced that he was backing this idea called integrated information system, which was this extremely ambitious theory of consciousness that attributed consciousness to certain kinds of information processing in the brain, and not just in the brain, but information processing in general. And it was defined, information processing was defined in this very broad way, so it could even be ascribed to a single proton, which, if you look at it in the right way, consists of 3 quarks that are exchanging information between them. So an implication of this theory that Koch was backing is that all matter is conscious. A single proton is conscious. This leads to this ancient metaphysical idea called panpsychism, which says that consciousness isn't just a property of certain kinds of biological matter. It's a general property of matter, and therefore it pervades the entire universe. I thought this was nuts. In spite of taking a lot of LSD and being interested in mysticism in my youth, I ended up becoming kind of a hardcore materialist. And so the idea of panpsychism seemed ridiculous to me. So I immediately started thinking, when I heard that Christoph had gone veering off in this direction, what the hell happened to him? He must be going through a midlife crisis. And he actually started espousing this idea soon after Francis Crick died. His marriage had also ended very painfully for him. His father died, a bunch of things had happened. So I started thinking, obviously subjective personal factors have influenced his supposedly objective view of consciousness, his objective view of this scientific problem. And then that actually was one of the reasons why I wrote Mind-Body Problems, because I then sort of generalized that and realized that, of course, in my own case, personal experiences also have an effect on my supposedly objective scientific views. And I knew other scientists who also had this interconnection between their personal and professional lives. And so I thought that a way of exploring that idea would be to have profiles of Christoph Koch and a bunch of other scientists whom I knew to have had these sorts of experiences, sort of traumatic or dramatic experiences that had changed their scientific outlooks. And then I kind of generalized from that and said, this is a deep truth that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about the mind-body problem.